Welcome to the first Lemann dialogue on Brazil, looking at the question of development challenges in Brazil and the role of universities. I'm Marilee Grindle. I'm the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, one of the, as I said last night, one of the co-conspirators in bringing three universities together around the Lemann dialogues, and I'm very, very pleased to be here and pleased to be able to introduce our first panel. Last night we had, I thought, a fascinating roundtable that set the stage for the discussion today about higher education in Brazil. A range of questions were introduced by our panelists. For example, what is the role of higher education in a growing economy? What is the role of the university sector in fueling that growth, but also for Brazil, very importantly at this time, for sustaining it? What are the challenges facing universities in Brazil in terms of the capacity to absorb a growing number of students, the capacity to prepare leaders in research for the academic community itself, but also for research and development in the private sector. The issue of quality in secondary education, if we think of secondary education as the gatekeeper for possibilities of higher education, then we have obviously to think about secondary education and its quality. And as soon as we begin thinking about the quality of secondary education, we have to address the issue of the quality of primary education. So we can't just think of the universities in isolation from the rest of the sector. The issue also of encouraging study and research in particular disciplines and fields that are considered to be most important to the future of Brazil. These and a number of other questions were raised last night. And I think, interestingly, towards the end, we also had an interesting discussion of the role of universities in contributing to the depth of democracy in society and in government. So this morning, we have a panel on higher education in Brazil. Because it's our first panel of a very, very tightly organized day, I'm going to be a virtual bear about time management. We're going to be very carefully monitoring the panelists and the discussion so that we can set the standard of finishing on time and moving on to the next panel during the day. The presenters will begin with Mary Arends Koenig from the University of Illinois. She is the director of the Lemann Center for Brazilian Studies there. We'll follow with Jorge Lemann from here at Columbia University, an old friend of many of us. And then Marcia Lima from the University of Sao Paulo and Eduardo Biotti from the University of Brasilia will be our commentators. So let's begin, please, with Mary.
Okay, so I'm going to start things off. This presentation, I'm going to give an overview of what's happening primarily in secondary education. This is a lot of data that comes from Naircio Meneses from the Panorama Educacional at Innsbruck. So he does a great job of putting together data and looking at long-term trends. So one thing I want to start off with, this was part of the conversation last night too, and I'm trained as a demographer, so I see demography wherever I go, and I think it tends to get ignored. So I think we need to think about the background of Brazil when we talk about education to understand that this is occurring in the background of these demographic changes. So when we look at things like the number of people graduating, the number of people enrolled, we got to keep in mind that the number of children is decreasing. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. So just to some points here, demographers will talk about the demographic gift, and that is when fertility declines rapidly, which happened in Brazil. Brazil is now below replacement fertility. I looked it up this morning. It's 1.8 children per woman. It's lower than the United States fertility. In fact, it's below replacement. So when that happens, you have small cohorts of children, and it's a huge opportunity because your money goes farther. So you have the same amount of money, but you have fewer children. You can really do a lot of good things with education that way. The importance of cohort size, and I'll cite Lemann and Martelletto for those who might be interested in looking at some of those issues. When kids are in a large cohort, which happens during demographic change, then the resources get spread out more thinly. And also an underlying change that's happening that we don't often pay attention to is that mothers' education of these children is increasing, and this is a positive thing. We know from all the research that's done that mothers' education is very closely tied to children's education. And so in a very short period of time, from 2000 to 2009, for children ages 15 to 17, the mother's education went up by a year and a half. It's still low. 6.5 years is still a low level of schooling. But these are reasons, the demographics behind this are reasons to be optimistic, just for demography, without even thinking about policy. So these are great conditions for improving education. I want everybody to kind of keep that in mind as we go forward. So looking at some data here from INSPIR, this looks at secondary school enrollment rates. And here we don't see this as much stagnation as we talked about last night. So if we look at the bottom line, which is the net rate, so that would be based on kids who are the age group for secondary school, that is increasing. And that is now up to 50%. Of course, that's not high enough, but we see steady progress in that area. And then the blue line is the gross rate. So we see here, this is showing that a lot of the kids who are in secondary school are older than the appropriate ages. So we know that a big problem in Brazil is a lot of repetition. That's getting better over time too. So this, again, getting at this difference between a rate and the numbers, this is actually looking at the numbers that are enrolled in secondary school. So here we do see this stagnation. If we look at the top line, which is, again, a gross enrollment rate, and we see that that's actually declined. But some of that, again, is demographic rates. And if we look at the rates before, we saw was kind of steady progress there. The gray line that's on the bottom is also a net rate. So that's looking at 15 to 17-year-olds. And we see that the increase is not as rapid as it was maybe during the 90s or the early 2000s, but it's still happening. We talk a lot about repetition rates when we talk about education in Brazil. So here's another cause for optimism. Those are falling. They're still very high, so we see by 2009 it's above 30%, and this is for secondary school. So it's not declining as quickly as we might like, but it is falling. So that's a good development as well. And then looking at Pisa scores, that's one thing I've always been very impressed with Brazil. I think it was very courageous of Cardoso back in the mid-90s to say we're going to have a national exam and we're going to publicize these numbers because they always look really bad, right? So you need to measure things before you can figure out what's wrong and before you can improve them. So this is looking at what's happened to those scores since the first time they were given in 1995, and we see. SAEB is what? Sistema Avaliação Educação Básica. And also it became the Prova Brasil, so this is based on that. So if you look at the bottom line, that would be for the 4th grade. The red line is the 8th grade, and then the green line is the last year of high school. So what you saw was a decline in these scores as the educational system expanded and you brought all these kids into the school that were not in school before. Then the average of those scores is going to fall. And we see that recently that's started to improve. Well, what do these scores mean, though? It's still not very good because by the end, even those scores, that means that 60% of these kids are performing below a minimum level of competency in that grade. But there's cause for optimism because those numbers are increasing, right? So if we look at the trends over the last 3, they're going up.
If we look at math, I think if you look at the fourth grade here, there's even more cause for optimism because those scores seem to be increasing pretty rapidly. We don't see much with the eighth grade. That's been pretty stable, not improving very much. But I believe that once these fourth graders start making their way through to these other grades, we're going to start seeing, I'm optimistic that we're going to start seeing those scores increase as well. Here's a slide looking at the transition into college. So this, the light gray panel is looking at those that finish high school. So this is high school graduates. This is, again, some of the information that we're seeing, that the number of graduates has been kind of stable, and maybe you look at that and you think that we have a problem here, that there's sort of stagnation. Again, some of that's driven by demography and the fact that there are fewer kids in this age group. And then if we look at the darker line, that's looking at the kids who enter into college. So it's looking at entrance into tertiary school. So you can see by 2009, if you look at those two bars, that's showing us that maybe a little more than half of the kids who are finishing high school enter into the university in the following year. And Claudio Castro, who was supposed to speak in this session but unfortunately couldn't be with us, he sent a document that's in your folders. One thing he talked about is how it's very typical in Brazil that kids don't graduate from high school and then immediately enter college. So they might be entering later. So we need to keep that in mind and maybe not be so panicked that, not to interpret this as only half of the children who finish or the young adults who finish are going to college, because some of those will go into the university later on. Here we look at enrollment rates in tertiary education. The gray line again is the net rate, so that's looking at people in college age, which will be about 17 to 22. And the blue line is looking at net rate. So this is making the same point again. So if we look at just in the age group, there's progress there. There's steady progress there. So now about, according to this, about 15% of the students are in that age group are attending tertiary school. But if we look at the blue line, we can see, again, this is what Claudio Castro was pointing out, that you have people who are older who are going to school later in their 20s, in their mid-20s. So they get there eventually. And here I see there's steady improvement. Maybe not as fast as we might like, but it's there. Here, this looks at university enrollment between the public and the private schools. And I think what's very impressive here is the huge expansion in primary school that's happened since 2000. So now about a fifth of the students go to public school, and 4/5 of them go to private school, and that's been expanding. There's always issues there with things like quality, the price that these private schools are charging. Are students getting their money's worth out of it? What kind of information is out there about these schools? And how are young people able to make good decisions about where to invest into school? This is looking at graduates. So again, you can see the numbers are much lower than the enrollment. So here, I know the numbers are a little hard to read, but it looks like in 2008, which is the latest year, there were about 600,000 graduates from the private schools and a little less than 200,000 from the public schools. So that's a total of about 800,000 graduates of secondary school, or I'm sorry, from the university level. And a little bit about Pisa scores. There was a lot of to-do around the last round of Pisa scores because Brazil showed a big improvement in math. It was the third biggest improvement of the countries, and I believe Brazil now ranks 52nd out of 62 or so, 53rd out of 62. So go Brazil. So that's improvement, but from a very low level. And again, some of the analysis shows that most of this improvement is due to a fall in repetition. So the issue was, since PISA is an international exam that's given to students in many different countries to compare and contrast. Again, this was another thing that Cardoso agreed for Brazil to take, showed some courage in saying, yes, we're going to participate in this, even though we're going to look really bad. So since you're looking at 15-year-olds, Brazilian 15-year-olds are not necessarily in the grade that they're supposed to be in. So most of this improvement was due to the fact that repetition rates fall. So more 15-year-olds are in the right grade for their age. But even though we see this improvement, it's still not adequate. 60% of the students who took the PISA scored below the minimum that indicates that you have mastered a basic set of numeracy skills. And if we look at this in comparison with Korea, and in the last round, Shanghai participated, not all of China, but Shanghai did. If you look at Korea, only 5% and 3% of the students scored so low as the Brazilian students. So 60% are in this bottom tail in Brazil, only 5% in Korea, and only 3% in Shanghai. If we're thinking about global competition here. And in Brazil, only 1% scored at the highest level. So the elite, the internationally competitive, only 1% of those would take the exam. And this comes from a study by Barbara Bruns from the World Bank that just came out last year looking at Brazilian education. One thing I find very interesting, so there are a lot of policy changes that are happening in Brazil, which makes it very exciting to be studying, but also frustrating because then it's very hard for people to say what's causing what or to look at that. It's very hard to disentangle everything. But one thing I find very interesting about Brazil is the reliance on test scores and the researchers' positive orientation towards them. So in Brazil, there's the Basic Education Development Index, which is now calculated for each school. And this is based on taking the test scores in schools on SAEB and the Prova and multiplying by a pass rate. So schools also have to have kids progressing well through the schools. Otherwise, you could just have the smartest kids take the test and you can game the test. But these scores, I'm always very interested in information and how it gets to families and how families use this. So these scores are publicized by school. So it's in the media, it's on TV, it's in newspapers, it's available to schools. And there's some research that's being done now looking at that and trying to disentangle the causal effect of doing that and indicating that it does have an effect. And then there are targets set by the ministries for these individual schools to improve. And schools are meeting this target. So this seems to be motivating schools to improve their quality. Now, it's very interesting to contrast with the US where we have we had a federal program, No Child Left Behind, which most researchers think was not a good idea. But in Brazil, these tests people seem to be very positive about them and their improvement. So I'll just end here with some research questions I think would be very interesting to look at going forward. One is, there's so many changes going on now. People running around doing tutoring programs, doing all these things that look like very good ideas, but not much research being done looking at cost effectiveness. So what are the cost-effective interventions for improving student learning? And then if you find some in particular areas or schools, are these context specific? Can they be applied in other places as well? I also think, coming at it from as an American as well, some of the problems that you hear people talking about in Brazil are very similar to things that we talk about in the United States. A public school system that seems to be failing students and is not preparing students for university. How do you reach those students? How do you keep students on track? So I think that would be very fruitful to have some comparative studies and to learn from each other. And one thing, I had the fortune of seeing Claudio Castro in Belo when I was there last month. And one of the things we talked about was the community college system in the United States. So Claudio, he talks about in his paper, you have people graduating from Brazil, but they're very low performing. Then you take them in the university. University becomes like high school, so there's an issue there. And in the United States, part of that role to remediate, to be a bridge between high school and the university is the community college system that we have. So what could be, is there something that could be done in Brazil in a similar model? And likewise, all the things that Brazil's doing to try to help students learn, and how can the United States learn from that? And then this issue of test scores and their role, some of the caveats of using them. How can schooling systems use these test scores and use this public information to improve student learning. So, and Brazil's system is very advanced. It covers the whole country. So how can the United States learn from that? So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary, for really setting the agenda of issues that need to be addressed and discussed. And thank you also for doing a superb job of giving us lots of information, lots of things to think about in a minimal amount of time. And now, Jorge, it's your turn.
Good morning, everybody. For those who are just coming in or have problems waking up, I'm not Claudio de Mora Castro. Unfortunately, he's not with us today. But I was supposed to comment on his remarks. And since he's not here to present them, I volunteered to make a mixture of his own remarks, my own comments, and God knows what else within the time limit that we have. What I will do, you have Claudio's notes in your folders. What Claudio does in a very persuasive way is bring up a set of generally accepted myths about higher education in Brazil and debunks them, says, there are myths there. Now, if you follow the list, most of the myths relate to the relationship between private and public providers, about, not only the overwhelming presence of private providers, but their supposed low quality, high cost, and mainly with the emergence of for-profits, the presumably, very entrepreneurial, very little educational attitude that takes towards teaching and learning. What I'm going to do is to make a few remarks, 10 in total, about the context in which this is taking place and how Brazil private-public relationship compares to the rest of the world, and include in my presentation some of the myths he talks about, his reply, and my own comments. Kind of smorgasbord of ideas, but I hope that there will be food for thought. First of all, there is overall consensus in Brazil that enrollment and graduation rates in higher education are too low and need to increase. Plans have been approved in the past with clear quantitative goals, but tend to fail in achieving them. A new 10-year plan is now discussed by Congress. Yet, after almost 2 decades of relative stagnations in the 80s and 90s, student numbers have increased quite sharply during the last 15 years. Private providers have taken the bulk of this increase, although the public sector has also grown rapidly. And I know that figures have been presented and there is some debate, but there is no doubt about two things: the jump in the last 15 years and the role of the private sector providers in that jump. Now, you have to realize that the private sector has played a more important role in Brazil than elsewhere in Latin America, and almost elsewhere in the world, with a few exceptions in Asia. And that has been the case throughout the last century, even before the advance of public federal institutions in the 1960s. So there's a tradition of private provision in Brazil. By 1975, 2/3 of enrollment was already in the private sector, highest, twice as much as the following cases in Latin America, Colombia, and Chile. Two important changes, however, took place in the mid-1990s that explained the trend in the last 15 years. First was the lifting of bureaucratic restrictions to the entrance of new institutions. And here, Claudio refers to the myth that accreditation became just easier too lax, and so on and so forth. And he says it's mainly a change in bureaucratic procedures and not necessarily letting in lower quality providers into the market. And second, and this for me it's even more important, enabling the emergence of for-profit institutions. In subsequent years, the federal government approved grant and loan programs to low-income students admitted in private institutions, which was a further stimulus to this growth. But this is very important in the context of Latin America, where private for-profit providers are generally absent. You have to remember, even in Chile, where this is hotly debated, they're absent from the university sector. The for-profit providers operate in the so-called centros de asistencia técnica and institutos, but not in the universities. These changes resulted in the consolidation of a highly entrepreneurial subsector of for-profit providers. These for-profit providers, 4 or 5 of them strictly Brazilian, 1 of them international, operate nationally or even internationally and invest considerable sums in producing their programs, training their staff, and standardizing procedures. The largest one today enrolls about 250,000 students in 67 campi and offer distance learning services to additional 140,000 students. It's one of the largest in the world. Differentiation between sectors is marked in Brazil. But if you look at overall differences, you get some surprises. Of course, in the number of institutions, lots of smaller institutions in the private sector. If you look at enrollment, predominance of the private sector in undergraduate, of public sector in graduate education. But at least I was surprised to find that full-time faculty make up at about 30% of the total in private providers. And also, although this figure is so surprising that I wonder what it means, 37% of faculty members in private providers have doctoral degrees. The contribution of the private sector also has been relatively more important in 2 underserved student markets. First, older students in the labor force. And that has already been noted by Mary in terms of the growth, mainly of after-age enrollment. And you can see that this is largely a result of private providers. This is total enrollment. This is enrollment in 3-year programs. The total is green, red is the private, and blue is the public. In other words, this long-sought reform in Brazilian higher education of providing alternatives to university training, although it's taking place in the public sector, mainly in the state of São Paulo, it is largely the case, but still a small number in the private providers. You have to realize that the scale is different. The upper line is reduced 10 times. So still, this is a relatively small number, but it's clearly the effect of private providers. A major constraint to enrollment growth in Brazil is the cost in relationship to income. And I know that these exercises are methodologically highly debatable, but if you consider all costs, not only cost of tuition, free tuition when tuition is free, but cost of living, and deduct the subsidies in terms of loans and grants, and divided by family income per capita, you get, of course, that affordability varies a lot and is considerably lower than in the rich countries, but it's even lower than, say, in Mexico or in Colombia. This is an index, so you shouldn't read this in any kind of strict way, but by and large, total costs take up at about 70% of gross national income per capita in Brazil. It's very high. And although there have been some subsidies lately compensating for that, they're far from compensating much. So cost is a major constraint. Now, a unique characteristic of the Brazilian system within Latin America is the long experience with testing and long reliance on testing and its use of in equity terms. We have, of course, ENEM now and ENADE, and these tests provide some food for thought to Claudio. He takes the ENADE is the test at the end for graduates of higher education, and he takes the ENADE results by themselves and shows that, of course, the publics come higher than the privates, but the difference is not that great. And very interestingly, the privates for profits, mainly the IPOs, which are the large corporations operating in Brazil, turn out to have relatively higher results than the privates in general. So this kind of entrepreneurial approach with standardized methods, with really lots of money invested in terms of training and things like that, turn out to be at least not that bad an investment as very often it is thought. Here he shows some of the scores and variance, very institutional type, and again you see that private for profits, the second one, the variance is much smaller. So they do provide a very standard higher education, most likely not to the taste of many of us, but still showing in terms of scores of learning and outcomes relatively well and with rather consistent results. Brazil has developed then a clear model of predominant private provision with a strong public role in monitoring and regulating of the private sector. The federal government also addresses issues of equity in terms of income with loans and grants, although, as I said, still far from being universal. Addresses regional imbalances mainly through the creation of new federal universities, and is now addressing the issue of racial imbalances, although the affirmative action programs, about which we will hear more soon, have been started by the universities themselves. But it is also a model of autonomous public institutions with a small subsector of highly productive research institutions, which are largely publicly funded through a combination of inertial and competitive mechanisms. Public institutions dominate the research and graduate training functions, providing highly subsidized undergraduate education to a minority of students. And by the way, one of the myths that Claudio tackles also is whether this kind of a very expensive education provided in research institutions is really so far superior to what is provided by others. Certainly in value-added terms, that doesn't seem to be the case. Graduate education is undoubtedly the crown jewel of the Brazilian system, about which Brazilians should be very proud, and we'll hear more about this in a few minutes, so I will not extend my comments about this sector. Last but not least, Claudio challenges, as I said, the myth about the superiority of learning outcomes in a research environment. The fact is that this is an issue worldwide, that most undergraduate teaching, including the US, does not take place in a research environment, even when teachers have a research-based degree. Institutions and faculty, however, all over the world have resisted the new trends in higher education that attempt to separate teaching and research costs in order to manage them more carefully and, at the end of the day, lower the cost of teaching in order to make it more affordable. Brazil is perhaps a most successful case of resisting that pressure, and that is a very serious constraint on the expansion of the public sector. Thank you very much.
For a fine presentation and a fine presentation of your own thinking combined with that of Claudio and Castro. Extremely interesting, and once again, setting the agenda for our discussion today. Shall we continue then with Marcia Lima?
And when I received when Thomas invited me for this comment, and these answers it's not me, not my question, but I received this task. How well the Brazilian university responds to the needs of society, and based on this question, I'd like to share some concerns result from my research, and based on the Professor Mary and Professor Balon comments. I think it's not fair, but I read the Claudio Moura Castro paper, and as George comments, I'd like to present some comments about the Claudio Moura Castro paper. And I think I will present the same data, but I have different approach for some questions. And my investigation try to connect the relation and try to connect among educational attainment, higher education system, and social policy. Now, how you can match expansion, quality, and inclusion. That's my approach here. About the first questions, educational attainment, and based on the Mary's presentation and based on my own data, and we have the same data, but I want to stress some question. This is the information about the educational attainment and attendance rates in Brazil. I want to stress information about high school and higher education and people out of school. Yeah, I think Brazil has improved the educational attainment and attendance, but the scenarios need an upgrade. We need to keep it going. You need to improve more these results. The Brazilian average of years of schooling is about 7-8 years. It keeps far from average from other Latin American countries like Chile, 10 years, Peru, and Argentina, 10 years too. Access to elementary education is universal in Brazil. 97% of the students, the people from 7 to 14 years old go to the school. But when you look at the 15 to 17 years old, and the attendance rate is 84%. And 50% of the young people from 15 to 17 years old are out of school. So I think they need to improve this formation. And so, like Mary said, the net attendance rate is half. 50% of these people from 15 to 17 go to the high school. And about the higher education, I agree with Claudio, but I think if we look at this table, we can see the older people go to university, to high school, but the proportion, both net attendance rate and gross attendance rate is low. Yeah. So we have 13% on the net attendance rate and 30% in gross attendance rate. People from 25 to 30 years old, we have 6.8 the net attendance rate and 11.8 for gross attendance rate. So I think you have to improve this number. In the elementary school, I don't have time to talk about it, but I think it's important to stress the universal access is the beginning of this level. When you start about 5th grade or the middle school, the rate attendance starts to decline. So we have social and racial inequalities even the middle school. So I think you have different transitions with different inequalities. And if we talk about higher education, For transitions, very important, access high school, finish high school, access higher education, and finish higher education. So we always we talk about access higher education, but when we perceive the people who finish higher education, undergraduate in Brazil, the situation is completely different. So I have to stress this. So Brazil still needs to improve access to high school and higher education. The proportion of the older people who attend school is low, especially who attend the higher education, and until 90s, poor and black people don't attend higher education. So that the point to discuss policy and affirmative action is important in the recent Brazil history. But the solution, I think, I agree at this point with Claudio, it's not vacancies, but more opportunities. So people don't go to the college or universities because they have to work, they don't have money, or they aren't eligible, or they haven't finished the high school. So that's the point to understand higher education. My second point, I'm finishing. I back to the George question about the higher education institution in Brazil. This data from higher education census. And my first question is, when we talk about university in Brazil, are we talking about higher education system? According to higher education census, less than 10% of the higher education institutions in Brazil were classified as university. Among them, 50% are public and 47% are private institutions. So the main difference between university and college in Brazil are the main difference are the profile of the faculty, investment in research and extension activities, and the number of the areas or courses of this institution. So when we talk about higher education in Brazil, we are talking about a system that is not academic system and mostly private. From the total of the higher education institution in Brazil, 89% are private institutions. So about quality, it's not fair because Claude's not here, but I disagree completely about the ENAD. ENAD is not the best way to analyze. It's not as good indicator because the best universities in Brazil don't apply to ENAD. USP don't apply ENAD, Unicamp don't apply ENAD. So if you look at the General Course Index, EGC, Índice Geral de Curso, I think it's the better measure, but not. I think we don't have good measure to evaluate quality in Brazil. But this information is about the faculty degree. George presented the same information. So I can't believe that the private and public institutions in Brazil are the same quality. So I think yesterday the Minister of Education announced let me see here. Is announcing 50,000 vacancies in the higher education will be suspended due to low performance, grades below 3 in the scale of 1 to 5, according to IGC, that's General Index of Course. This announcement is a warning for 683 institutions of higher education. This number corresponds to 30% of the higher education system in Brazil. So I think this point is you have to discuss. And so I think Brazil needs improved educational attainment for the old people, quality of the people for the labor market. Higher education is the gateway to professional and management positions, and reduce the effect of the education inequalities. So, in my opinion, to understand, in my opinion, to understand expansion, quality, I don't have time to talk about. I have little information about affirmative action in Brazil. We have affirmative action in private institution and public institution. And this table is information about the affirmative action in the public institutions in Brazil. So 35% of the higher education students, public higher education apply affirmative action, and almost 6% of the public university in Brazil apply affirmative action. In the private institution, we have ProUni, University for All. ProUni promotes the exchange of scholarships in private higher education by the exemption of federal tax for the participation institution. In both systems, the decision is the institution. So the participation is voluntary. Until 2010, almost 900,000 scholarships in the private system. Unfortunately, I think nobody has information about the number of the students, the beneficiaries from affirmative action policy in the public system. But I stress this point to finish my comments because I think you have to, I think the question is, what kind of expansion and inclusion Brazil is doing now? Given the size of the private system and its profile, how to ensure quality and expansion, how to match social demands for education with the demand for skilled people. Do they respond to the needs on the labor market? Do they have to respond? What the effects of higher education expansion in the profile of the supply of labor in Brazil? I think the connection between higher education system and the labor market is very important for this debate. So I back the question I received from Thomas, and my question is, what are the needs of society that universities can respond? Thank you.
Strikes me that our agenda of issues that absolutely have to be discussed is getting longer and longer. So I hope everyone is prepared to stay through the weekend. Eduardo Vietti.
Good morning. I would like to thank the organizers of this event, mainly the Center for Brazilian Studies at Illinois University, Harvard, and Columbia for the opportunity to share some ideas with you today. And my task here, as set by Tom Trebet, was to discuss graduate studies in Brazil, and I will just touch one specific aspect or two about it. Yesterday, we started to discuss about the numbers of how... pardon? And here you have all the numbers. You can do the math, and you can see what is happening. Here at the lower level, we have Brazil, and at the other level is the US. We see. You see here at the beginning of this period, 1987, Brazil graduated only 1,000 doctorate, or awarded 1,000 doctorate degrees in Brazil. And the US, more than 30 times more than this. And we can see at the end of the period, more than 11,000 students were granted doctorate degrees in Brazil, and almost 50,000. And this is a very sharp increase. And if there was some difference between some periods that we were discussing or debating yesterday, periods of different administrations in Brazil, Lula versus FHC, as we say in Brazil, FHC, I believe this is not the most important aspect of this trend. The most important aspect is continuity. It is amazing how this policy is consistent through more than 4 decades, where there were changes in governments, in administrations, even in political regimes. Since the military dictatorship in Brazil, graduate studies are being supported and sustained in a consistent way. We used to call this a kind of state policy, in the sense it's a policy that is continuous, and is not a policy of an administration. This is an example of this, maybe one of the few examples of this kind of state policies in Brazil. If we can, here we can see the share or the participation doctorate awards in Brazil as a percentage of those awarded in the US. At the beginning, 3%, at the end, almost 1/4 of the amount of doctorate degrees awarded in the US. This is a spectacular growth, as Claudio Moura Castro said in his paper. And if we think or we call to our minds the idea that in the US we have a population that is 50% larger approximately than Brazil. The GDP in PPP terms, purchasing power, is 10 times larger than the Brazilian one. And if we also recall the fact that approximately 1/3, more than 1/3 of the degrees are awarded in the US for foreigners, then this is an achievement. It's an impressive growth. Sorry, I need some water. Sorry for, this is to help me. In spite of its young history, graduate education in Brazil is becoming mature in a fast pace. The very fast pace of growth in the number of doctorate awarded in Brazil in all fields is just one indicator of the maturity of the Brazilian education at the graduate level, and it is coming to achieve. An analysis of the master degrees awarded in Brazil will show a similar picture. The overall size of the system of graduate studies in Brazil is also accompanied by a huge diversification and an effective system of quality control. Graduate programs are regularly evaluated, and its results have huge consequences for them. Carrots and sticks are associated with it. A good performance in the CAPS evaluation process is usually associated with more research funds and a larger number of fellowships, while bad performance could lead programs to lose their accreditation. Claudio Moura Castro, in the provocative and very critical paper he unfortunately was not able to deliver at this seminar, recognizes that Brazil has had a spectacular development in its graduate schools. In fact, it is the only segment of education that Brazilians can be proud of. Quality control in graduate schools is quite strict compared to other levels and to most other countries. This achievement is a consequence of policy that was sustained during 40 years. The Brazilian system of graduate education is a very important asset for its development process. This is an asset very few developing economies could rely on. How the whole potential of this asset can be fulfilled? What is necessary for the Brazilian graduate programs to give a greater contribution for the Brazilian development? They still need to keep growing, it's true. They need to produce more and better science, it's also true. However, they also need to educate different professionals that are better fit into the multiple requirements in the evolving process of development in Brazil. This is an objective that usually does not receive the same level of consideration as the previous ones, and it should. The expansion of graduate programs in Brazil followed the pattern that was mostly determined by the logic and the interests of the academy. But this is not functional anymore. Here we can have a picture of one of the results of a research project that was supported by CGE and led by Lúcia Mello. I was the coordinator of the research project, and we managed to have an idea about the employment by sectors of activities in the economy in Brazil, of all the doctorate holders that got their degrees from 1996 to 2006. And we can see that almost 8 out of 10 of those students or those doctorate holders are working in education in Brazil. This is a large concentration. In all countries in the world, the number of PhD holders that work at education is very high, but it seems to be much higher than the usual rate all over the world. And we can see also public administration being approximately 1 out of 10 of the PhD holders, and all the other 19 sectors of activities have only 1 out of 10 of the PhD holders. And the we can see here the professional and science and technology activities, 3.78%, and the manufacturing, only 1.4%. That is a very low rate, I believe. But we can have an idea about how this is performing along the time, in spite of being used just one sample, not one sample. We got data about the employment of the doctorate degree holders only the year of 2008. But we managed to analyze the cohorts of PhD holders that got their degrees in 2006, 1996, 97, all the years. Then comparing the cohorts that got their degrees in 1996 and 2006, we can see that there was a change in this period. The previous graphic was the whole stock of PhD holders for this period of years, more than 10 years. And here we can see only the cohorts of these 2 years. We can see how the share of education sector is decreasing in this period. It's very important when we can see that almost all other sectors or activities in the economy are increasing their participation or their share in the number of PhD holders. All sectors are increasing in a very fast pace because the total number of PhD awarded degrees in Brazil are increasing in a very fast pace. But in spite of that, the rate of growth of almost all and each one of the sectors are greater than education. This is the 6th and the 10th largest employer sectors. The share of the education sector in the employment of doctorate holders in Brazil seems to be disproportionately high. However, there are indications of a progressive reduction of the relative share of the education sector as the largest employer of doctorate holders. Let me finish this. Better information about the job market for master and doctorate degree holders must be produced and must be taken into consideration in order to guide the future expansion and diversification of the graduate education in Brazil. It should also inform the reformulation of its curricula. After all, it doesn't matter the level of education of a person if his or her education has no use in a job. Their education must take into consideration the present and future requirements of the market, the job market. However, this is not enough. The job market should also be developed in a way to create lots of quality or qualified job opportunities, and this is contingent on a broader and systemic policy. To be able to create enough qualified job opportunities is a more challenging task than it is the task to develop a graduate education system appropriate for the effective development of the country. But both tasks must come together. I leave also at the PowerPoint presentation a summary of the book that where I based this. Is a 500-page book with the statistics about the graduate studies, mainly only the doctorate, mostly doctorate degrees holders in Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Due to the extraordinary, and I must say, having had many, 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 many years of experience, I can say really extraordinary discipline of our presenters, we have a good amount of time for discussion. We have, in the past hour, gone from thinking about challenges in secondary education to thinking about the challenges in graduate education. If I could, in a phrase, sum up, I think what everyone was saying about different levels of education in Brazil, things are getting better, but there are still many gaps and many challenges in the future. So let's open up the floor for comments and questions. Shall we start with Fran?
If you do, Marilyn, if you don't mind, maybe put up your hand. There are people who want to speak or make.
Oh, yes, that's a very good idea. If people in the audience, if you just raise your hand, I'll try and see you. Can everyone hear me? Is this on?
I'll just talk loud. It's on? Okay. Well, I'd also like to congratulate everybody who just gave presentations. They were wonderful. I'm directing this question to Eduardo, but it could really be to anybody. I'm curious in the study of the production of PhDs and where they work, that the very illuminating chart that you gave us was where they actually find employment. But I'm sort of curious about what the percentages would be if we were looking at the number produced in a discipline versus whether they work in the academy or whether they work essentially as engineers or in manufacturing. In other words, is the problem of PhD, let's just take engineering for example, is the problem is that PhDs who are trained as engineers go to work in the academy because they're making individual decisions that they prefer to work in the academy than work in engineering, or is it that there's not enough opportunities in engineering for them? Are they making a decision, or is it a market problem? And the reason that these individual decisions become interesting is that in terms of, I mean, as I understand it, if Brazil has a shortage of 80,000 engineers, and the idea is to train more engineers, I don't understand why the market doesn't respond and simply attract qualified engineers, or I'm curious about whether the production of more highly qualified scientific and engineering personnel is intended to sort of shape and give and stimulate research, maybe coming through universities that could then partner with the private sector in order to generate more value-added manufacturing and sort of economic development opportunities. So I'm curious about this relationship between the production of PhDs and where they're working, rather than if we were looking at denominators within the sectors themselves.
I'm going to intervene and suggest that we take, say, 3 questions or comments, and then come back to our panelists for responses and clarification. So let's go with Werner and then with Joan, please.
I'd like some comments on the private sector in education. I've been visiting quite a number of private universities, and what bothers me about the private universities in Brazil is they're for profit. And being for profit, I've been in, I won't mention that state in the southern private university. They have a magnificent campus, but if you go there in the daytime, there's not a single student present. It's all night courses because the students have to work. Same thing, most of the professors. They have other jobs and then they go to teach in the evening. And it is sort of lamentable because kids who went to public schools, high schools, and cannot make the vestibular, and have to have it, and didn't get into public universities, after a few years go to these private universities, pay tuition, just in order to get ahead in their jobs. Whether they will get ahead in the profession, that's another question. I mean, it's lamentable to see these students, after working all day, being tired to take courses in the evening. And the same thing for the professors. And the other question I'd like to ask is, when we talk about private universities in Brazil, that's not the same thing as the private universities in the United States. In the United States, you have private universities who get public funds, including Harvard. They are governed not by the donors, but they're governed by the faculty. That's not the impression I have in Brazil. In Brazil, a private faculty is o dono. He wants to give as many courses as possible. That's where the money comes in. Research, and I'm abstracting from the Fundação Getúlio Vargas and from PUC Rio de Janeiro. That's an exception for lots of historical reasons. But in most of them, the emphasis is on teaching, maximizing the number of students, maximizing the number of hours that the faculty at your high can give. But those who make the decision is the boss, is the owner of the university. So the question is, structurally, is private education, especially at the university in Brazil, the same thing as what we understand to be a private university in the United States?
Thank you. Joan?
I would also like to address some questions to Eduardo about his very interesting study of the employment patterns of the PhDs. And while you pointed out that the number of PhDs concentrating in the education sector was declining, it nonetheless is still extremely concentrated. So I would like to know if in that 500-page book there is a finer-grained level of detail about, for example, those PhDs who remain in the education sector, what sorts of institutions that they actually teach in. Jorge mentioned the number of 37% of faculty in private institutions with PhDs. What about the regional question? Are those PhDs who may be largely trained in the top-tier public institutions in the south and southeast of Brazil, are they going to other regions? And in short, even within the educational sector, is the production of PhDs directed toward righting some of the imbalances that were referred to elsewhere in terms of regional quality, in terms of serving other populations in Brazil?
It seemed to me that those three questions are primarily directed to our three panelists, and primarily Eduardo, but it's also possible that Mary can give us some insight into the students, the high school students, going on to either private or public. I don't know, but that's a question. So.
I can try to answer the questions on the graduate education in Brazil. And first of all, the book is this one over here. I have no other copies of it, but you can download the whole book and every table of the book in Excel or in PDF at this site.
For free.
Where
not for profit, yes.
Yes. Okay. You can use and manipulate all the data. And it's mainly an exercise of getting the databases and being able to tweak them and work with them, and believe this is just a beginning of a large set of databases that would allow us at the CGE, where Lucia was the head of it, and it's going on this job over there. We have lots of things in this book. One, for instance, is a kind of matrix where you can look through one for the lines, for instance, to the sectors of activities. And in the columns, you can look for the fields of degrees awarded to the PhDs. We can see, for instance, that engineering, people that got their PhD in engineering, 71.4 of them were working in education. 71.4. We can see, for instance, that in industry, 1.7 only % of the engineers, PhD in engineering. And we can see this in all the sectors. Okay. We here in the U.S. there is a survey. Each 3 years you have a survey that goes to the PhD holders, and they collect lots of data like that. But the data is not. The classification by sector of activity is not comparable to this one. Then it's very hard to do. It's very small. It's not the ISIC. This Brazilian classification of activities is similar to the ISIC version, the International Standard Classification of Industrial Activities, version 4. Is similar to the Brazilian KINAI 2.0. And the US uses as almost all of these different classifications, and it's very hard to compare. Not only the industrial activities, but also the classification of fields of educational studies. And we can see, for instance, they have I believe that's approximately 9 categories. One is for-profit institutions, the other is federal government and state government, and I believe that the data is approximately 9% of the PhD holders in the US work for federal and state government, and approximately less than 50% work for education. But it's not a comparable data to what we are using here. And we have also, answering the other questions, the complex distribution for each field of graduates in PhD for each state of the country. We can see the distribution, and one of the very interesting features that we got is a kind of a stylized fact about this, is that the concentration in São Paulo and other southeastern states, the production of PhDs, education of PhDs, is larger than the concentration of the employment. The employment is more distributed around the country. It is still a small, tiny portion of the whole set of the whole stock of doctorate holders that work in the Amazon region. But it's much, much more than what they got, the number of PhD holders that got their PhD in the Amazon region, for instance. And the number of programs that are being established in the less developed regions of the countries are growing at a very fast pace in comparison to the traditional ones in Brazil.
Thank you very much. Comments on the private-public?
Well, I think Werner has touched key myth issue. It's first of all, this is happening not just in Brazil; it's happening elsewhere, whether we like it or not. In the U.S., the fastest growing providers, private for-profit providers, now takes about 11% of total undergraduate enrollment. And there's a debate. There's a debate mainly in the US, not in Brazil, because it's heavily subsidized through voucher systems. In other words, about the largest percentage of Pell Grants and student loans subsidized by the federal government is used today in the private for-profit. That is not the case in Brazil. In Brazil, it is not that they're sucking funds from the system that could be used for the public system. They are, if you want, making a profit out of payments from students and their families, generally middle income or lower middle income students. And there you have actually two questions. First, do students have another choice? should they have choices in subsidized public institutions of good quality, most likely they would take them. The problem is that those choices do not exist, and they do not exist because there are serious constraints on the public sector to expand its supply at a lower cost. And keeping the costs of the USPs and Campinas and Federal de Rio de Janeiro for the whole system is just impossible. Also, it is the case that one size does not fit all, and that not only you could not, absorb all these relatively middle-income Brazilians already in the labor force in the current public suppliers, but most likely you would have to change the nature of that supply. For instance, now more night courses, more part-time students, and so on and so forth. Diversity is the key issue, or differentiation is the key issue. At the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, Werner, what is it better, having this choice or no choices? Now, of course, Brazil is already spending quite a lot in public funding in higher education, and maybe it could spend more, or it could spend better, and take care of the needs of a greater variety of students, including issues of access and equity. Certainly it could. But I think that the point that I saw expressed in Claudia's paper, and I certainly support, is that a major issue is what are the constraints on the public sector. We know also that growth in enrollments and a more equitable system depends largely in changes in demand, and changes in demand are going to take place with reforms in high school rather than reforms in higher education. Last but not least, I'm not a big defender of for-profits, but you have to take seriously their ability, partially because they have to respond to stakeholders that have the money, in their ability to turn out information about themselves. You can learn more today about private providers than you learn about public providers. You can follow quarter by quarter how many they have enrolled, how much they're paying, what are their characteristics, and how much earnings they're making. So I think that, if anything, the expansion of for-profit providers increases transparency in the system. I know that I ran out of time, and this is not a question I have been asked to, but I join the rest in saying, that the graduate doctoral education is a crown jewel. But we have here two questions that are relevant and are related to the overall discussion. One is, at what costs? And second, who benefits? Now Brazil is spending over 1% of its GNP in science and technology. That includes a lot of money for doctoral training. It is well spent, it should spend more, but there are, certain emerging questions about, how much you have to subsidize, and mainly if, some of these doctorates, and certainly MAs, are going to work in the private sector, you have to ask yourself if the federal and state governments should take all of the cost. Thank you, I'm sorry.
About the private.
This working. Exactly. Hold it close.
I think it's the debate about the private sector in Brazil is very, very complicated and necessary because the proportion of people who finish their higher education in Brazil in the private institution has increased. So we need to look at the quality of this institution. And I think this sector, worker students support private institutions in Brazil. And the proportion of this institution classify as universities 9%, 10%, no more than. And you have, I think you have to improve the quality of the private education system, but the question is how improve the quality in the system. I think the policy, social policy, as a probably as this problem, I think the way of to ask more quality for this institution can announce. Now you have to discuss with the private system, because without private system we don't have expansion in Brazil. So how we can match quality and expansion? So maybe the social policy, the social inclusion could be a way to negotiate with the private system the quality of this institution and select more. Maybe this program could be more selective in terms of the scholarships and the negotiation for the quality. I think that's the point. How negotiate quality of the private sector?
Wonderful. Mary, do you want to?
Do I want to jump in? I think with the private universities, and I'm coming from this as someone who studied nursing in the Philippines, which is very private. There's an issue of what is the returns that the students are getting on this. So despite all this quality issues, and if this, I would think if the students are able to get a return on that and that translates into better job opportunities, then I don't think I'd have much of an issue with it. I don't know what the studies have been on this or looking at this. I think we need more studies to look at that. And I think also it's important that students get accurate information and they're not being deceived. So students are not going in thinking, I'm going to pay this money and I'm going to come out and I'm going to have this fabulous job. That this school has this wonderful placement rate. And I think there's a lot of areas for research there. What do these students know? How are they making these decisions? What are the returns on these private universities versus the public universities? So I'll just end it there.
Wonderful. Let me, on behalf of all of us, thank this extraordinarily interesting panel. We have the opportunity to continue to discuss these issues throughout the day, and I've just negotiated with my two neighbors here that they can get priority in asking, making comments and asking questions if they'd like in the next panel. And since Tom is running the panel, I think I can trust him to at least get his comments on the table. But this is to keep us on schedule. I think this is a good time to move on to the second panel. And once again, thank you very, very much for this extraordinary